Hi, everyone. You don't always get the opportunity to curate a seminar based on a book that I've been working on for many years. I started working on this project on Improper Names, I think back in 2008, and I published it in 2015. So before talking about Improper Names, I want to ask a few questions, because when we started brainstorming around how to structure the seminar, we said, okay, what is this seminar going to be about? Who are we going to invite? And I would say that for me, this is the driving question of the seminar and the reason why we selected some people to participate and not others. So rather than thinking about individuality and collectivity as two separate spheres, or spheres that sometimes stand in opposition to one another, we're really interested in looking at this kind of passage from the I to the we, and how can we talk about it? Because I think that the grammar in art and politics around this is still pretty old, and in a certain sense, the algorithmic measurement of the passage from the I to the we is more advanced than the language that we are using to describe this kind of relationality. So how can we grasp something that is constantly in flux, that concerns the sphere of affect, right? The capacity to affect others and be affected, of the intrasubjective, of something that happens in a certain sense below the level of subjectivity. Philosophers such as Gilbert Simondon would describe as a process of trans-individuation. And so, as I said, network capitalism is doing a pretty good job, I think, in measuring social relations. It's doing it especially via social network sites, by attributing scores. For example, I don't know if you are familiar with the way, for example, the Facebook algorithm that decides what is more important to you, or supposedly more important for us on the wall of your profile, decides that. It decides that on the basis of a score that attributes to every action that you take, and that score is unidirectional, so that if you comment on somebody else's post, if you like somebody else's post, each of these actions has a score, and that determines whether this person's posts will show at a certain level in the hierarchy of the Facebook posts. So in our case, perhaps we're not interested so much in measuring relationships, I hope, right? But we might be thinking about what I call syntaxes, right? Perhaps grammar, I think, is a little too totalitarian for my taste, but syntaxes, I like syntax because syntax often allows for many things to be concatenated in multiple ways, right? So I'm interested in really looking at how we can connect things. And I think in this seminar, we'll do this through three different layers. The level of language, Improper Names, I'm gonna be talking about it in a second. I think through the work of General Raunig, especially through the question of Con-Dividuality, individual compositions, through the work of Wuming, the narrative as psychic warfare. Natalie Bookchin, I think, will in many ways talk not only about that, but also about the status of the network image in her work. And I think Christine Sue Lucas, but also in the performances of Janec Janša, of course, I think we can reflect upon the discursively mediated, what I call the discursively mediated body. So quickly, I don't know if you can read this. I didn't realize that this was so dark. Of course, Gerald is going to talk about his own book, right? But what struck me about this book when I read it is a key thing, right? Like, he does a genealogy of the term dividum. And the dividum is different from the individuum. This is obviously a Latin term, because the dividual, that which is divisible, right, divided and divisible, is governed by the principle of similarity, whereas the individual is governed by the principle of dissimilarity, right, of that which cannot be composed with something else. So to be governed by the principle of similarity is actually a pretty good advantage, because if you are similar to something else, you can compose an assemblage with something else. Whereas if you see yourself as an individual, then you are detaching yourself from the possibility of attaching yourself to an assemblage. In the case of Wu Ming, this is Wu Ming presentation that we're going to have tomorrow, but I put up there a quote. So this is narrative as psychic warfare, right? The Wu Ming collective is a collective of writers, currently composed by 3 members, comes out of the Luther Blissett project. I put up the quote by Mackenzie Work: "To abstract is to construct a plane upon which otherwise different and unrelated matters may be brought into many possible relations." And I think that what the Luther Blissett and then the Van Wing Foundation was precisely to construct this syntax through which many things happened, not randomly. There's many offshoots coming out of Luther Blissett, and I can't go into that because you might not even know what Luther Blissett is. But what I'm interested in is that through its work, the Wu Ming Foundation created these possibilities that are syntaxes, are connections, and they do not close. They open up possibilities of further concatenations. This is from Mass Ornament, a performance, a video installation by Natalie Bookchin from 2009, I believe. And it's a very powerful video that you can find online, because as you can see here, these are girls who are dancing in their homes, but they're imitating each other's gestures, right? And so, as you know, on YouTube, there is this practice of the response video, right? And so this is, for me, if we want to think about each of these slices as a individual component of an image, right? This is a Con-Dividual concatenation that, of course, you can find it algorithmically, which is what also YouTube does to a certain extent, but that's obviously not what Natalie did. She dug deeper into the YouTube archive, and she reconstructed, right, a dance, Mass Ornament. So she recreated a syntax that is a non-algorithmic syntax. And the performance by Christine Lucas that's gonna happen soon, to me, when I think about the discursively mediated body, right? So she refreshed herself, right? She went to court in California asking to change her name, her birth name, Christine Sue Lucas, into Christine Sue Lucas, right? And so the performance is about the judge and Christine the judge trying to figure out what's going on here, why this person wants to change her name into her actual name. And for me, this interrogates, right, who we are every time we relate, for example, to the state, right? This kind of discursive formation. And at the same time, Christine comes as a background from net art, internet art. So when you refresh a web page, right, you are starting a new session, what Gilles Deleuze would call a individual session, right? So these are 2 different kind of discourses, the discourse of technology and of the internet that is conflated with the legal discourse, and how that also impacts your subjectivity. And of course, this is also a discursively mediated, in many ways, situation. I like the fact that there is this interrogation, right, of the structures of the state that tell us who we are, but we hardly ever ask her the question back, right? And I think that what these artists are doing is precisely to foreground these moments that are too often made invisible to us. So I'll switch here to my own work, and I'll start with this short clip from the movie Spartacus.
Have we a count of prisoners? We haven't made the final count, sir.
I bring a message from your master, Marcus Licinius Crassus, commander of Italy. By command of his most merciful excellency, your lives are to be spared. Slaves you were, and slaves you remain. But the terrible penalty of crucifixion has been set aside on the single condition that you identify the body or the living person of the slave called Spartacus.
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus.
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus.
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus. I'm Spartacus. I'm
The reason I show that clip for multiple reasons, because it allows me to introduce my book. But before going into that, you should know that the screenplay of this movie was written by Dalton Trumbo. And Dalton Trumbo was the most famous screenwriter in Hollywood, who was blacklisted, who was the face of the Hollywood 10, the 10 screenwriters who refused basically to make names before the House Committee on American Activities, right, the McCarthy era that was investigating communist infiltrations in Hollywood, right? So they decided basically to take the Fifth Amendment and not to start to keep naming other communist sympathizers. And as you probably know, the mechanism there was this kind of hellish mechanism, so that if you wanted to save yourself, you had basically to spy, to rattle somebody else, right? So basically you had to show that you would cooperate with this committee. It was like a true witch hunt by saying, I think he might be your best friend, might be a communist sympathizer, right? And that way you would be able to get out of it. So the Hollywood 10 are the 10 that say that basically no more of this, right? And in 1960, you get the first movie in which Dalton Trumbo, after using pseudonyms for almost a decade, pseudonyms of all kind, is finally able to sign the Kubrick movie as Trumbo, right? So it's pretty obvious to me what that scene means, right? It's pretty interesting. So the first level, right? So if you think about this scene, right, we can think about it, I think, in three ways. Obviously, there is a function of the Spartacus name of obfuscation, right? If everyone is Spartacus, then no one in particular is Spartacus, right? But also, it's obvious that the people who share that name are recognizing each other through that name, right? So there is a function of obfuscation and recognition. Second, if a lot of people are Spartacus, a lot of people are deciding to adopt the name, then Spartacus is a pretty powerful subject, right? So there is a certain symbolic power that begins to get attached to the name. And third, this is not something that you would see in the movie, but it's kind of more a speculation that I introduce here. Let's suppose that the Spartacus revolt, which is an historic event, was not suffocated in bloodbath, right? In a bloodbath, and that actually, I mean, this is a movie; it's a Hollywood movie. But let's suppose that for a moment, these people really picked up that name and then managed to escape the repression. Then they would go around marked by that experience, carrying on that name with themselves, right? And so you get the hypothesis that there is a certain proliferation of difference, meaning there is a possibility that the Spartacus name might have an afterlife and might be embodied by many different subjects. So these three hypotheses correspond to these three features of the improper name, which I will define in a second. So I would say that improper name has this function of empowering a subaltern social group by providing a minimum for identification and mutual recognition to its users, the users of the name, enabling those who do not have a voice of their own to acquire a symbolic power outside the boundaries of an institution of practice. I will refer to what I mean by that in a second. And then, as I say, it expresses this process of subjectivation, of becoming Spartacus, characterized by a proliferation of differences. So I decided to, be pretty formal, because in American academia, I wrote this book doing a doctoral dissertation. You are taught, for better or worse, to kind of formalize your thoughts. And I said, okay, I'm going to give a definition. Maybe people are not going to like it, but I'll try it. And I'll say that an improper name is the adoption of the same pseudonym by organized collective affinity groups and individual authors. And if you pay attention to this, you will see that there is a certain tension here, because on one hand, I make references to organized collectives, on a second level of an affinity group that is already not an organized collective, and on a third level about just random individuals using a name. So there is this tension between the organized and the spontaneous, centralization and decentralization, the collective and the individual. So let me go back to that notion of symbolic power outside the boundaries of an institution, as I say, right? So the concept of symbolic power has been introduced in academic lingo by Pierre Bourdieu, right, the French sociologist, and he defines as this symbolic power as this power of the acting on the social world through performative utterances. So an example of that is a state official or a religious authority saying, I hereby declare you husband and wife, right? In that moment, that's a performative utterance that has the power to enact, right? The word has the force of action. And Bourdieu says that in order for that power to be effective, to really act on the social world, it has to rest with an authorized spokesperson or a ministry that has an institution behind it, right? So, for example, he makes this example. He says, you can go out and declare the state of emergency. You can be the leader of an army, right? And declare the state of emergency, or the leader of a state, and declare the state of emergency, and everybody would believe you, right? But if you are just a random individual and go out and say, I hereby declare the state of emergency, people would just think that you are a fool, right? Why? Because the difference between an ordinary individual and a head of state or a general of an army is that these people have an institution behind them that gives their words the force of action. So I thought about this. I said, but I still want, and I thought, I still think that improper names or collective pseudonyms are a form of symbolic power. So how can I deal with this? And I said, okay, they are a form of symbolic power, but this power is not managed through an institution. It's managed by those who use the pseudonym, who decide at a certain point to take up a name and share it. How? How do you manage this, right? If it's a random process, you can't really manage it. And I say, okay, you can manage it through what I call an authorizing context, right? In an authorizing context, you can determine who has, for example, a right to use the pseudonym and how to use it. So what is an authorizing context? Well, it doesn't have to be necessarily an institution. It can be a collective, right? It can be a political collective, an art collective. It can be an online community, or it can even be, as we will see, a sanctioned organization, a formal organization. I'm not denying that a formal organization cannot use or try to use or manage a pseudonym, because there are examples of that, right? In this authorizing context, that the tension between a collective use, possible collective use of a pseudonym, and kind of random uses, spontaneous uses, is managed. So before I get into explaining myself, because this is kind of the theory ahead of the practice, I will add that, okay, if there is an authorizing context controlling a pseudonym, so why do you talk about I, right? It's a collective process. But the thing is that as I started studying the use of these pseudonyms, you see that they start traveling at a certain point in the public sphere through certain media, and people appropriate these pseudonyms, and the original authorizing context loses control of the pseudonym. That's what I call an improper name. It's precisely that moment in which the control is lost. Because I also found pseudonyms, collective pseudonyms, in which the authorizing context never lost control of the pseudonym. The case of the Nicolas Bourbaki collective, a collective of French mathematicians, for example, for me is a collective pseudonym that is not an improper name. So, first case study, the Luddites. I don't know how many of you know that the British Luddites, the machine breakers of the 19th century, right? We still use that term, you are a Luddite, to say that you are a person who hates technology. Sometimes people say, I'm a Luddite, I hate technology, right? But this is an eponymous term that comes from this movement, and this working class movement, or pre-working class movement, named itself after a general, or there were various ways of calling it, General Ludd, King Ludd, even Eliza Ludd, there were so many different names, which was a fictional persona that they had created themselves. So they pretended to have a leader who was an imaginary leader, who was leading the Luddites, who named themselves after their leader, to destroy not every industrial machine, actually, yes, every industrial machine, but not every machine, because these were people who were working in workshops, originally around the Nottingham area, right? And they were using machines, they were using technologies, but they did not want the new technologies were labor-saving machines, who were basically destroying the guild system, the system of apprenticeship, a whole basically system that had been inherited from the Middle Ages. And so they were targeting machines of a specific kind. Historians of the labor movement all agree that the Luddites were not an anti-technological movement. There was a selective movement that was destroying only specific machines. At the same time, over the past decade or 15 years or so, historians have started to analyze the writings of the Luddites. Because the Luddites, even though there was no universal education yet, right, were teaching themselves how to write. And you know, they were teaching themselves how to write to do what? To send threatening letters to these manufacturers that were adopting the new labor machines that were basically destroying their livelihood, right? And so they would say, if you don't remove these machines from the workshop, General Ludd is gonna come and destroy them, right? So there is this level of direct action, but there is also this kind of discursive level, and these letters have been collected and all published in a wonderful book that is called Writings of the Luddites, that allows us now to read Luddism also as a rhetorical strategy. So this gives you a sense of the force of the Luddite movement as it begins to spread, right? Because this name acquires this kind of Robin Hood status in 1811, 1812, and the movement is at its peak at the moment in which, note, 1811, 1812, the UK is at war with France, with Napoleon, right? Which is doing the continental blockade. So think about a situation of a nation at war that has an insurrectionary movement inside, because that's what Luddism was basically an insurrectionary movement. But then if you study these writings, you start to see that this name is not used so coherently. When it enters the Manchester area, where you have the cotton industry, so it's a new industry, it's not the old woolen trades, right? It's the industry through which in Manchester the Industrial Revolution that's where it boomed, where it started really. The water looms and all, then the new industry is really coming out of there. Well, there is not a pre-existing structure of guilds there to defend this kind of old traditional ways of working, the system of apprenticeship. So the workers in the Manchester area use the name Ned Ludd to demand higher wages in the cotton industry, which is kind of a proto-early form of class struggle. In other cases, you find the name associated with riots for lower food prices because the Brits were starving at the time, and even, in some cases, for political agitation and the abolition of the monarchy and the institution of the Republic, inspired, obviously, by the hated French who had just done the revolution, even though they now had an emperor. So I basically say, well, this is not just a pseudonym, right? This is a proper name of a fault line, the fault line that divides the guild system from the modern system of industrial relationships. So on the one hand, you have this last struggle of craftsmen, right, against the industrial means of production, of people who just did not want to have the industrial revolution because they were perfectly fine with the old system of production. On the other hand, you have a proto-early form of class struggle in which these workers demand higher wages. There were no unions, no trade unions in 1812 in the UK yet, right? The trade union movement rises later after the 30s and 40s, right? But they somehow find themselves to establish this syntactical relationship through this pseudonym, right? They have a connection to one another. There was no internet at the time, right? So they read about chronicles in papers about the lad did something in this area of the country, in this other area of the country, and they appropriate the name, but to do different things with it. So H.P. Thompson wrote about laddism, right? And he basically rescued laddism, he says, from the condescendence of history. He basically says, Marxist historians of the labor movement have always looked at the Laddists as this kind of backward-looking movement. And H.P. Thompson basically says, no, it's actually a movement that looked backward in order to move forward. And it had the possibility almost of becoming Ladd, this is my claim, this hegemonic link between these different forms of subjectivity, because a cotton worker from the Manchester area was a quite a different thing from a woolen trade worker from the Nottingham area. But ultimately, this link doesn't happen because the Industrial Revolution wins, right? And therefore, the craftsmen of the guild time are swallowed by history, right? Craft disappears. It becomes a marginal activity. It's still on, but it's marginal as compared to the industrial production. But there is this moment in which we can perceive this possible relationship. Second case study is 150 years after, but there is a connection between the two, because in this case you have a sanction organization using a pseudonym, and it's the Directors Guild of America. The Directors Guild of America, right? The union of the Hollywood film directors, the ones who had just kicked out Weinstein. I think they kicked him out yesterday from the, was the Guild of Producers. But it's interesting to me that in Hollywood they have all these guilds, right? That they see themselves as part of a craft, even though, as we know, Hollywood is the most industrialized system of production, of cultural production in the world. And so in 1969, there is this curious thing that happens. There's this movie, Death of a Gunfighter, that they are filming. And at a certain point, the star of the movie is Richard Widmark. He's a Western. I'm not going to tell you the plot, but Richard Widmark gets into a fight with the director, whose name was Robert Totten. And of course, Widmark wants more time for himself because the director wasn't really that important back in the 60s. So Totten says, I'm just going to walk out. New Line Cinema, I believe, calls Don Siegel, the director of The Invasion of the Body Snatchers, who was an excellent director also because he was very productive, and says, Don, please, can you come and finish this movie, because we have spent so much money here, and we don't know, the movie's done, basically. So Siegel goes in, and in like 2 weeks, edits the movie, and looks at it and says, well, this is a pretty good movie, but I'm not going to sign it. This is not my movie, right? Totten is completely out. So the New Line Cinema goes to the DGA, to the Directors Guild of America, and says, look, we have a movie, it's done, but we don't have a director. Nobody wants to sign it. What are we going to do with it? And the DGA says, like, are you going to give us a pseudonym or something to? And the DGA says, well, let us think about it. In the beginning, they think about the name Alan Smith. Because it's just like a whatever. It's like in Italian it would be Mario Rossi. It's like a whatever name, right? And then they say, no, we should add 2 E's to make clear that this is an artificial name. And from that moment, the Directors Guild of America and the producers, the MPAA, agree that every time a movie is going to be tampered with, the director is going to apply for his MIDI credit, and he's going to be able to sign the credit, the movie as MIDI, so that in Hollywood, everybody's going to know that something wrong happened there. But note, what is really important there is that only in Hollywood people have to know, because otherwise, if the public at large will know that that movie stands for tampering with the creative rights of the director, nobody's going to watch the movie, right? So the silent agreement, it's a union agreement around the pseudonym, is basically that you can use as a director this MIDI credit if you get a cut that you're not happy with, only insofar as you do not badmouth the producer in public and don't say what happened. So this thing stays on for 30 years. If you go on, I don't know if any of you are online, to imdb.com right now, and you Google or you search for Alan Smitty or Alan Smitty, you will find some like 50 movies that have been signed by this author, right? There is a whole filmography of Alan Smitty movie. And there are books written by critics about Alan Smitty. The film critics have written about Alan Smitty as an author, right? So by the end of the 90s, something really funny happens here, because this guy, I don't know how many of you remember this movie, American History X, a pretty good movie, actually. But Tony Kaye, who is a director from the UK, gets his first movie, is actually director of advertising for the most part, gets his kind of opportunity to make a movie in Hollywood. And of course, the producer says, no, this cut, basically when you're in Hollywood for the first time, you're not gonna get the cut that you exactly want. Even now that directors have much more power than they used to have in the past, the producer is still going to have a strong say. You have to build a reputation for yourself in order to be in full control of your cut. So Kaye hates the cut of New Line Cinema, and he does all the craziest things. He begins buying ads in Variety. He invites a priest, a rabbi, and a monk, and a Buddhist monk, and he shows them the two cuts, the producer cut and his cut, and he wants these three spiritual figures to say which one is best. And the producer is just completely... So eventually he doesn't get his cut. He doesn't win the fight. And so he goes to the DGA and says, look, I want a Smitty credit. And the DGA looks at the case and says, sorry, we can't not give it to you because you badmouthed the production company in public. You bought ads on Variety, and this is not part of the union agreement that we have. So he said, okay, then I'm going to sign it Humpty Dumpty. And they said, no, you can't sign it with any pseudonym. That makes obviously a reference to manipulation. And you start seeing here the very conservative function of the union here, of the guild, right? So they get into a legal fight over whether you can use a pseudonym or not. In the same year, Disney releases this Burn Hollywood, Burn and Alan, it's called Burn Hollywood, Burn and Alan Smitty film that tells the story of a director whose actual name is Alan Smitty in the movie. And the director, of course, gets a horrible film cut from the producer, and he wants to get rid of the movie and sign it, but the producer says, no, the only authorized pseudonym is Alan Smitty. So the director goes on the run with the film, with the actual film, and tries to burn it. That's the story. So basically, Disney outed the name, right? Breaking also the union agreement. This hasn't played probably a role, but it's interesting that also in the same year, in 1999, you have a collective of film critics who ran a conference at the University of Pennsylvania treating Alan Smitty as an author, right, and analyzing the bibliography. So this becomes basically a loaded signature where this kind of negative symbolic capital, right, Smitty is the sign of failure, comes to the foreground. The public begins to learn about this case. And so both the producers and the union agree that they shouldn't be using Smitty anymore because they cannot control the pseudonym that has now taken a life of its own. Negative symbolic capital can take a life of its own, and you have this emergence of a reputation economy within post-Fordism that makes it difficult for the sanction organization to manage and control symbolic capital from above, right? As shown by the case of Smithy. Third case study is the case study of a collective sorry, it's not a collective in this case, really. It's a network of artists who used the name Monty Kansin. So this started in the late 70s, already in Portland, Oregon. It spread to Canada. And male artists, when I say male, I don't know if it's on the slide, but I mean male as in, not as in men, but as in postal artists, okay? So male artists, I don't know, many of you are familiar with the male art history, but basically send each other a lot of art through the postal system. And many of them use pseudonyms to manage different correspondences, right? So they have these multiple personas depending on whom they are corresponding with. So in the late 70s, a group of male artists in Portland, Oregon says, look, instead of using all these pseudonyms, like each of us using 10, 20 pseudonyms, why don't we use all one, right? So they reverse the process, and they say, let's all use Monty Kansin. And then they say, you know, we can use this name also for public performances because they had musicians in their networks, but they don't say much else, right? They say basically anybody can pick up this Monty Kansin name and use it. And so this is something very different from what we've seen so far, because the authorizing context, in this case a network of artists, doesn't really, as compared, for example, to the Directors Guild of America, that basically say you can only use the pseudonym if you are a Hollywood film director. If you apply for a pseudonym, we're going to look at the case very closely. So they control really access to the pseudonym. In this case, the opposite is true. They just disseminate the pseudonym through the network. As I said, it allows artists to share their cultural capital. It's also a critique of the culture industry, of course, obsession with originality and novelty. And it's also a critique of the historic avant-garde, because Monty Kansin is nothing but the kind of persona of this pseudo-avant-garde movement called the Neoism. As you know, the modern avant-garde is obsessed with, it's called the avant-garde, with this idea of surpassing, right, leaving the past behind. And Neoism doesn't mean anything. It's kind of this tautological expression that celebrates the new for its own sake. So it's a very kind of postmodern, ironic détournement of the avant-garde, right? And so finally, as I say, the final function is to give the art of networking, right, a persona, right? It's this work of correspondences, of networks that acquires a persona, not necessarily an embodied persona, but an abstract one. Well, there was a problem that the person who was using the name the most in the beginning was using the Monty Kansin pseudonym in conjunction with his birth name, István Kantor. He's a Hungarian-Canadian performance artist who's very well known in Canada, also a little bit known in Europe. But fights erupted within the network between people who said, look, you can't use it as a pseudonym of your own person, because this is a collective, it's a pseudonym that we're sharing. If each of us begins to use it as saying, hey, Marco Deseriis, aka Monty Kansin, the whole purpose of this thing is going to be defeated. But in actual fact, because what I say, there were no real instructions for use, and this idea was to create kind of a semantic chaos, right? Ultimately, the project, I think, imploded, even though Monty Kansin was very important for many reasons, but they also had a lot of internal infights, right? So in a certain sense, you don't have an ethical set of guidelines that can allow an authorizing context really to, if I wanted to use a bad word, I would say to police the use of the name. It's not about policing, but it's about a common project, right? But it's interesting also that Monty Kansin is the first multiple use name, right? A multiple use name is different from a collective pseudonym because it lays the emphasis on the fact that anybody can appropriate the pseudonym and do something with it, right? So you start seeing this shift from the plane of collectivity and control to the plane of spontaneous appropriation. Victor Baroni and Stewart Home were, I think, very important figures. I'm not going to go into their bios, but one is based in Italy, very well known, perhaps the best known postal artist in Italy. And Stewart Home is a pamphleteer, cultural activist, novelist based in the UK, who basically got in touch with the co-founders of the Luther Blissett project in Italy. And this is the fourth case study. And I also participated in Luther Blissett in Rome. And they say, look, we learned something from Neoism. They knew that somebody in Bologna wanted to start a new multiple use name project. But they told them, they told in particular to Wu Ming Wan through correspondences saying, look, there is not many things that you need to do, but the one thing that you need to do is to make sure that nobody's going to claim that they are Luther Blissett, right? So just get rid of this obsession that somebody is the author of Luther Blissett. And so Luther Blissett starts around this idea of clouding the origins of Luther Blissett itself in mystery. Luther Blissett was a soccer player in Italy. It's a British Jamaican soccer player who played in the UK for the most part, in Watford, but he came to AC Milan in 1983-84, and it was this kind of spectacular fiasco, right? So Italians in the 93-94 remembered Luther Blissett from 10 years earlier as kind of synonym with fiasco. And if I had more time, I would tell you how this notion of a fiasco is embedded in all the pseudonyms that I've actually encountered, right? And the idea was to create a series of sophisticated media pranks, right? To sell fake stories to the media, fake books to publishers, to create the myth of a folk hero of the information age that would kind of also embody the persona of this kind of art of networking of cultural workers who were getting precarized, right? Worse and worse the working condition. And we also called the Luther Blissett the Con-Dividual. And this term in English sounds pretty strange, but in Italian it doesn't, because the term Con-Dividual derives from condividuo, from the Italian condivisione, which means sharing. But as you can see, condivisione, it's a dividing together, right? You are together as if you take a pie and then you share it. So you start from something common. At the same time, it does not, because it's about division, it does not necessarily presuppose a community, but only a concatenation of parts or things that get connected to one another. As a matter of fact, the users of the Luther Blissett name might share just their temporary homonymy. So Luther Blissett was also a multiple use name. You can pick up Luther Blissett and do something with it. We start the project with something in mind, but you might also deviate. And of course, you can deviate only to a certain extent because there were collectives that were trying to still manage this in a authorizing context that was pretty strong, right? So it's a network. If I had to describe the authorizing context here, I would describe it as a network of collectives, though, right? Because there were various collectives and smaller cells in various Italian cities. In Rome, when I participated in Luther Blissett, to give you a sense, we were doing this radio program that first started in Bologna in the summer of 1995. And when I went to meetings for the radio program, I realized that my collective of Luther Blissett in Rome was only one of 4 or 5 collectives, or groups, if we want to call them that way, that have formed around the same idea only in Rome. Then there were groups in Bologna, in Viterbo, and in many other smaller also Italian cities. So really hundreds of people made use of this name. And as I say, this is where this idea that, let's say, we always discuss about the possibility that fascist or racist people or sexist people might use the name for doing something that we completely disagreed with, right? But instead of saying, oh, you just can't use it for fascist purposes, we always thought about devising counter strategies. And at the same time, I think Wuming Wan can correct me if I'm wrong, that really fascists ever tried to make use of Luther Blissett. There's also this dominant element of the narrative, because in 1999, one of the groups in Bologna that have founded Luther Blissett in Bologna published this novel that tells the story of a persona that goes through several name changes during the Protestant Reformation, which became a bestseller. And therefore, the name Luther Blissett became strongly identified also with this collective of writers. And also the collective of writers at that point, for tactical reasons, decided to change their name from Luther Blissett into Wuming. And they declared the seppuku, right? They basically said, we're gonna be killing the name Luther Blissett to pass to the next project, right? And this created a series of tensions, right, within the network, because obviously a good storyteller can tell a very good story. So the paradox here, the self-critique that I make of Luther Blissett is that Luther Blissett refused to have a myth of origins by creating multiple stories about the origins of Luther Blissett, but he had a myth of ending, in a certain sense. The suicide, exactly. Even though it was pretty clear from the press release that was sent out that the press release said, we're not saying that everybody has to follow us. If you want to keep using the name, you can keep using it. This is just a mistake. And then, I have sometimes these kind of cats that are percolating through the internet. But the invisible bike allows me to backpedal a second and say, that this authorizing context manage the relationship between the I and the we, dissemination undermines control, and shared pseudonymity allows for obfuscation and mutual recognition, which is what I said in the beginning. And then I'm going to be talking about this later after Gerald's presentation. I decided to break my talk because I had the introduction about the seminar, so it's too long. And Anonymous requires a whole different set of lenses and ways of, I think, of understanding what Anonymous does as an improper name. So I'll take a break here and I'll continue later. Thank you. And so what I find interesting here is the last line, right? Identity is a pointless thing for people like us. So why not let go of it and become anonymous, where you don't become anonymous with a lowercase a, but you become anonymous with a capital A. And this is where I think anonymous is something else than from pure anonymity, like understood as just anonymity in the common sense of the word, right? This is an anonymity with a capital A, which I think means something. So I'm not gonna do the history of 4chan, but you know that most of you know probably that Anonymous comes, I hope, comes out of this image board that was launched in the United States in 2003. An image board is basically a website, I wouldn't even call it a platform. It's a website where people exchange. It's a discussion thread, but the only requirement is that you have to post an image, right? When you reply, at least when you start the discussion thread. The default in 4chan is anonymous, meaning, as you can see there. So if you post, you will be, and you don't change this. You can change it if you want, but if you just simply type in something, you will be labeled like that. Thing is that everyone, these are different people posting, and so this can be thought, if this is a individual slice, right? Something a divided, something that is divisible. This could be a Con-Dividual assemblage, right? So the conversation in 4chan is anonymous, is asubjective because you no longer know who's speaking here, and it's also con-dividual in that is composed out of dividual contributions, right? And I'll get to this later. What happens in 4chan is that people start congregating, and Anonymous itself is actually born as an internet meme, because 4chan was called an internet meme machine. That's a place where people put ideas there, right? And the key affordance of image boards is that they do not have really a database, right? They have a limited storage space on the server, but if a lot of people post, that storage space is taken up, right? So the server has to get rid of some data, and it gets rid of the older ones. So if you want to keep a discussion thread alive, you need to reply to it. Because if you do not reply to it, it sinks in the back pages of the forum, and then it's erased, right? So internet memes were generated at a very fast pace, and are still generated, but they, especially in the late 2000s in 4chan, because people had to make very quick decisions about what to reply to, right? So if you had an idea, and this idea catalyzed kind of mind power, attention, people would reply to it, and that discussion thread would keep evolving, and a meme, which I assume you know what it is, would evolve out of that discussion. Whereas ideas that did not have this capacity to mobilize brain power would sink to the back pages. So you have this kind of powerful selection dynamic within 4chan that reminds, in a certain sense, of like genetic selection. And I don't know if you know the origin of the term meme, but the meme was introduced as a term by Richard Dawkins in this book called The Selfish Gene. Richard Dawkins, a famous evolutionary biologist. In 1976, he publishes this book, The Selfish Gene, which is by and large about evolutionary biology and genes. But the last chapter is dedicated to this kind of idea that he puts out there, is that we could start analyzing culture as nothing but a series of evolutions of memes that are the cultural counterpart to a gene. So he asks very big questions there. For example, he says, how comes that the idea of God has been around for such a long time, right? So can we trace that back? Why has it been around for a long time? And of course, when Dawkins was asked, what do you think of internet memes? He replied, as sometimes intellectuals do, I do not understand them. And by that he meant that the unit of this, I think, memes was too small, I think, as compared to the big questions that he was trying to ask with this idea of creating memetics as a science of studying memes. So here we are definitely in a different realm, but what is interesting there is that it's not just a set of ideas, it's also a set of ideas that become actions, right? And these actions take the form of what 4chaners call raids, using this kind of imaginary from the movie V for Vendetta. And raids can be very dangerous devices because it's a swarm of people who do not identify themselves, but can also be very entertaining devices. So for example, in this case, they decided to raid the Hub Hotel, which was a game for teenagers who were basically socializing themselves online on the internet. And word that spread on 4chan that the moderators of the Hub Hotel were banning black avatars from the game, which was completely a rumor. So they decided to go there and basically create a series of identical avatars with afros, right? Hundreds and hundreds of avatars begin to storm the game and kind of block the game, but they do this kind of swastika-shaped things that kind of block access to the pool, creating havoc, right? So this kind of highly contradictory dynamic. And they call this the lulz, right, which is this corruption of laughing out loud. And Gabriella Coleman has described the lulz as this kind of form of enjoyment and bliss that celebrates its own raw power and is divorced from any moral hinge. So you can't really try to categorize. And lulz, of course, is a achieved through trolling, which has been defined by this famous troller, Andrew Hauernhammer, as a method or style of rhetoric and action. And he describes it, I think, very effectively here when he says, you look for someone in the board or online who is full of it, a real blowhard, then you exploit their insecurities to get an insane amount of drama, laughs, and lulls. Rules would be simple. 1, do whatever it takes to get lulls. 2, make sure that lulls is widely distributed. This will allow for more lulls to be made. The game is never over until all the lulls have been had. And what is interesting here, I think, is the passage between 2 and 3, right? This will allow for more lulls to be made. So trolling functions as a positive feedback, right? If you know something about trolling, and if you are the target of trolls, you know that the first thing you have to do is not to respond. If you respond, they do precisely what he says, right? They will use your reply to just keep trolling you. They get more information from you, and that's all they want. That's what the game is all about, right? It's making people's lives miserable, and they can make them really miserable. In the case of raids, they would start sending dozens of unpaid pizzas to deliver pizzas to people's home, calling them, and just like people had to change their homes. And in some cases, it took also, in the case of Gamergate, for example, very sexist and problematic turns. But what I'm interested in here is that this is really the opposite of Facebook, right? 4chan was on the rise and became the first image board in the United States for traffic, with up to 1 million unique users per day, just to give you a sense, in the same years as Facebook was becoming a massive platform, right? So people would maybe get a Facebook account and then a 4chan account. And in 4chan is precisely the place where you have no moderation and where this kind of positive feedback increases instability, pushing the system towards turbulence and chaos. But in 2008, something different begins to happen, right? Out of 4chan, this is one of the longest battles of the internet of people against Scientology. There is a video that is released online with Tom Cruise, right? It's this internal video of the Church of Scientology in which Tom Cruise is kind of looks a bit out of his mind, and he talks about the fact that if you are a Scientologist, you are the only person who can help somebody else. If you see an accident on the road, you go for it because you are. It's this kind of mission. There is the Mission Impossible soundtrack in the background, and this was an internal kind of propaganda recruitment video of the Church of Scientology. But because in the Church of Scientology you have a lot of people who have been, trying to get out of it. The church basically sues you as soon as you try to make use of their materials. It's all trademarked material, right? So this video is leaked online, and the church goes in this kind of legal mode and begins suing YouTube and all the websites that try to reproduce it. And on 4chan, people say, we should do really something about this. And in the beginning, it looks a bit like one of the raids that they'd done before, but then it becomes a very structured, a very big campaign that goes on in some 50 different countries. And it's coordinated also through demonstrations on the street. And it's called Project Chanology. And a Project Chanology is no longer a raid. It's not something that lasts a few hours or a couple of days. It's something that is structured and that cannot be coordinated through 4chan because it's too primitive in a certain sense, too raw as a platform. So it's coordinated through the IRC, the Internet Relay Chat network. And what is interesting about the Internet Relay Chat network is that people use pseudonyms, because if you log into IRC, you have to create a handle. It's a text chat, but you use handles. And so in the Internet Relay Chats, you get a different kind of reputation economy, right? Because in the image board, all the users contribute to anonymous, are anonymous as they post on the board. In the IRC, you have this pseudonymous reputation economy in which certain users are more important than others, or acquire certain reputation for their technical skills, for their hacking skills, as they target the Church of Scientology in the beginning and then other campaigns. So basically say that the swarm, this idea of the raid as a swarm, is the organizational form, and the raid is this kind of raid is the improvised action that stems out of the image board. The activist network is the organizational form, and the operation, the structured action that stems from IRC. So you see how these two different participation devices, if you want to call them that way, produce two different modes of subjectivation, right? And so if you want to go back to this idea of anonymous as an improper name and the authorizing context controlling the improper name, you have a hybrid authorizing context. Because in the image board, you have this anti-celebrity ethos. If you try to create a pseudonym on 4chan, everybody would attack you because you are not anonymous in that moment. But you have this kind of de-individuation, right? Because you're no longer responsible for the consequences of your action, which leads to this kind of moral ambiguity of the lalts, right? Whereas in the IRC, there are these groups that emerge out of all these different chats, and there is this kind of unified struggle against censorship that, however, is accused by those who just want to enjoy themselves for the lalts of being, they accuse the leaders of Project Chanology of being moral fags, right? The word fag is used in 4chan ubiquitously, and we can discuss whether that as a anti-gay connotation, or as some people claim there, is just so ubiquitous that it has lost its meaning. As an improper name, so anonymous stands on the cusp between this kind of complete anonymity and shared pseudonymity, amoral action and ethical political activism. And so when I think about this kind of tension, I do it through this philosophy of Gilbert Simondon, who talks about the transductive process, right? And he says that a transduction, he talks about, for example, the process of crystallization of water that drops and begins to form crystals, right? So you have a metastable solution, right? A system that is filled with potentials that begin to structure itself. That's what, for Simondon, is a transduction, right? So the transduction is this process of passing from one plateau, would say Deleuze and Guattari, to another. We could also use the term singularity in that sense, right? But also it's the moment in which these dimensions emerge as intention and correlated to one another. And so looking at the early history of Anonymous, because I look at it from 2005, 6 through 2011, I say that there are three different transduction phases. The name has this function of transducting these kind of dimensions that enter into a tension with one another. The first phase is the one of the phase of the birth of the name Anonymous, which actually is born out of this struggle between those who wanted to use a pseudonym in the board and say, look, if you don't create a trip code, which is a way of creating a pseudonym on 4chan, you're not responsible for what you say, right? So it's completely pointless. And the other ones reply by basically saying, no, we are anonymous. Like, you can't be one there, right? So this goes back to the Monty Kansin use of the Istvan Kantor, aka Monty Kansin, right? So anonymous is this kind of powerful moment of this emergence of the we, which emerges through this confrontation, this transduction between these two factions. The second phase is the passage from the raids through the more structured operations that have a political purpose. And then the third phase is the phase in which Anonymous connects to the Arab Spring in 2011 and through Tunisia and Egypt, and begins to provide kind of network support for the revolutions in Northern Africa. And at the same time, you have certain hacking teams that are coming out of the same network that actually go on hacking sprees, right? They keep hacking and hacking and hacking a lot of websites for the lulz. And so, again, that kind of idea of the lulz never disappears, because what Simondon tells us about transductions is that you don't simply pass from one phase to another, but the previous transductive phase constitutes a base for the next one, right? So this idea that the lulz, for example, disappears here as Anonymous gets more politicized is wrong, because the lulzy element, which then resurfaces, with all a series of moral, amoral actions. You can connect it also to the Pepe the Frog, more recent, highly problematic use of 4chan. The lulls is never over. But the concatenation with social movements is a very interesting moment because it's a moment in which a lot of people in Anonymous also get on the ground in Occupy, for example, in the United States and in many other social movements. And they say, look, I come from Anonymous, but now I'm doing things here in this encampment. And for me, politics now has a value as a localized practice, right? So there is this tension between the deterritorialized nature of the network and also a practice that is more embodied, that is localized. And finally, one thing I wanted to say about the use of botnets, because one thing that Anonymous does is to use botnets to attack websites. And a botnet, of course, is highly problematic because in a botnet, you can have one person controlling thousands of machines, and there might be other persons implementing other forms of electronic civil disobedience that are more horizontal and democratic. And so it's like somebody holding a gun or a cannon during a demonstration and zeroing the expressions of everybody else by just pushing a button in a certain sense, right? But Simon Dunn says something about the use of technology that I think is very interesting. He says there is in invention something which goes beyond the community. I think this connects also to Gerald's talk, and institutes a trans-individual relation proceeding from individual to individual without passing through the communitarian integration guaranteed by a collective mythology. It's basically saying that technology has an ethos of its own that is not the ethos of the activist community necessarily, right? It's not a political ethos in the way we understand ethos as emerging out of a communitarian practice, and that this kind of tension injects a difference and produces new tensions.